Switching to Ruby on Rails was very difficult because looking at that, there's so much that just the Ruby on Rails magic that happens under the hood. And I would go, what do you mean? It just does this and that. Like, where are the intermediary steps? Once you're dealt with problems like that a lot, it can be really uncomfortable to go into a place where there's a lot of magic in the middle and you don't necessarily trust the magic anymore.
Welcome to SaaS That App, Building B2B Web Applications, the podcast where we share real-world stories, practical advice, and tech insights for those building or thinking about starting a tech-enabled business. I am your co-host, Aaron Marchbanks.
And I'm Justin Edwards. Each week we bring you the stories, strategies, and insights you need to build your SaaS or tech-enabled business smarter, not harder. Let's dive right in. Hello, everyone, and welcome to SaaS That App. Thanks to the miracle of release schedules, while you were hearing this, hopefully I will be somewhere in Thailand on a beach.
Lucky.
On the show today, we are going to be talking about native applications, specifically in Android, the Android iOS, versus a cross-compiling tool like React Native. To talk about that, I have brought on one of our favorite employees here from Delta Systems who came to us via an acquisition as an Android developer, which I identified immediately as a problem since we don't do Android work, really. He was incredibly quick and talented to get reskilled into React Native and also to Ruby on Rails. We identified him immediately as someone who was just doing a great job and would be great to kind of step up a little bit further. He's now doing a team lead role here. So came to us via an acquisition and has just been really awesome to work with. This is Kevin. Welcome to the pod, my friend.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Justin. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. And I am joined, as always, by my slightly more bearded than usual, but equally bow-tied friend, Aaron Marchbanks. How's it going, buddy?
Going well. Thanks, Justin.
Cool. Well, just to kind of level set a little bit, Kevin, would you mind giving us just a really quick, dry definition of what the difference is between doing a native app versus doing something cross-compiling like React Native?
Yeah, sure. So when you're working with a native app, especially on Android, you're generally going to be building directly for the Android API. So what that's going to look like for you as a developer is you're going to be downloading and installing Android Studio. You're going to be coding in either Kotlin or Java. And when you actually compile and run, you're running directly on an Android device. So for actually running, you have a couple different options there. But at the end of the day, no matter what, you need an Android device or an Android emulator to actually run. You can't obfuscate that part away. When you're doing development in a React Native environment, you're not actually developing specifically for Android. You don't need Android Studio explicitly in order to develop on that platform. You can use really whatever IDE you prefer, and you're going to be building that out in either JavaScript or TypeScript, usually for React Native, and you're going to be compiling it for Android or iOS. So you're platform agnostic to a pretty strong degree in comparison to native Android, where when you build something for native Android, it's built for native Android. You're not putting that on iOS. That's just not going to be a thing you can do.
That makes sense. And so one of the reasons I wanted to sort of bring this forward is at some point, our customers, other people who are developing apps and SaaSes and products are going to have to come up to a decision point of, do we go do native apps for iOS and Android, or do we do kind of a cross-compiling situation? I think there are some places and perks for each of those, but I guess what's your take on what would generally be things that pushes you towards recommending that someone actually go through writing iOS and Android native apps?
So nowadays, I feel like there isn't as strong a reason to do native as there was in the past. One of the bigger impacts or reasons you might choose to do so would be if you're reliant on some tools like Bluetooth or sockets. Stuff like that can be easier to deal with on Android or on iOS, respectively, natively. Just because when you're in that infrastructure, you don't need extra tools to go ahead and do things there. It's all built into the platform, so it's simpler to deal with in that respect. The other thing that can really come into play is performance. React Native, JavaScript, it's inherently single-threaded there. There are a few different threads for managing the tasks, but you're not going to be able to get as high a level of performance out of React Native, at least not in the simplest form of it. There are actually interesting options I was reading about recently. Shopify apparently has been doing things with native modules that they build out as a library that they can then use in their React Native projects instead. So they can get better performance out of a React Native system by using native where they can, using React Native where they can, and kind of unify their UI view, even if they have some different software lying under the hood for performance purposes. But I think that really comes down to being the biggest thing is performance. And for a lot of apps, I don't think that's necessarily extremely prevalent, especially if you have a simple front end to your website or something along those lines. The performance issue just is not going to be very prevalent at all.
But if you're doing like a video game with like 3D graphics and that kind of thing, that might be harder to do in the context of React Native, unless you do something clever with like having your own native modules.
To my understanding, at that point, you're probably building entirely within your game's toolkit is. So if you were doing something in Unity, you'd be looking at using Unity there. I'm not entirely sure how that ends up working out, though.
Yeah, great. I'm super ignorant about native apps. I've only worked on a handful, so it's good to hear to educate me. It occurs to me that we kind of do an analogous thing in Ruby land with machine code, like either Rust or C. So when you're like doing a bundle install, you'll see compiling native extensions behind the scenes. And that's basically the same thing where we're saying we're not going to do this in Ruby. We're going to have some other kind of background, usually to get close to the machine or for performance reasons like active record, for example. So it seems like a similar kind of thing where, yeah, we're using Ruby primarily and then we're kind of hooking into some lower level code. It sounds like Shopify is doing something similar with React Native.
Yeah, that's the case with a lot of modules or a lot of plugins and things like that too, will be closer down to the actual hardware rather than still being in JavaScript.
And Kevin, I know that used to be that there was a concern or you always had to worry about playing within the walled gardens, especially on the iOS side, but Android to a certain extent has kind of stepped up to that too. I mean, how big of a consideration is that anymore? I mean, to get into those arenas versus just simply going with something that's more agnostic?
I don't think it's going to be easier if you go with a native application for actually getting it published on the stores. I think in a lot of ways, especially with Google lately, it can almost be harder to deal with some of the API level changes they have rather than if you like separate yourself a level away from that. So if Google is constantly trying to move, like you said, towards more of a walled garden ecosystem. They started out with a lot of features. They were the Wild West, in air quotes, as you might put it, for app store fronts.
That's why everybody wanted to go there first.
Yeah. And it was really convenient for a long time. But now as they put bolts on and say, hey, you can't do this quite the same way you were before anymore, it can get really troublesome to continue like dragging along apps and updating them and having the functionality still work the same way as you move up and towards that. And it can be very frustrating to deal with. So I think there's probably value in having React Native or a framework like Expo or something between you and the Google API levels like that, just to shield you a little bit from the pain that they can inflict.
Well, like you say, you got to manage then multiple code bases if you're just purely native. I'm curious, is there a situation you've come across or a time when you might recommend using both, doing both, like having native applications and then separately or in tandem with having something that's React Native based? Is there a situation where that would come into play?
I'm like having two full apps like separately published.
Yeah.
I can't think of an instance where I've been in that situation. I feel like that would probably be a fair situation where you maybe look at either, because at that point you're looking at maintaining three separate apps, right? You're looking at maintaining an iOS app, an Android app, and React Native app. And in that case, it may be worth either dropping one of them, that probably the React Native app in that case, or looking at if you can integrate the other two back into the React Native app and just have one. Because I think having three over having two or having one is probably the least advantageous situation to be in terms of cost and how much time people have to spend on it.
Sure. I just didn't know if there was like a compelling reason for somebody that might be coming into, a legacy type situation where they have two applications, but they're also wanting to, do I need to just chuck this completely, rebuild in React Native? Do I need to maintain what I already have and then build in React Native and ultimately replace the two? Are the performance bits for me having the native applications compelling enough to keep them around, that sort of thing? I'm just thinking maybe legacy situations where, a client may be interested in, for whatever reason, keeping all of those around. I couldn't think of one off the top of my head either. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, I guess I could see one in that specific situation where you're looking at building something new out is you have these two legacy native apps already, and you're building features into a newer cross-platform one. There's probably a justification for leaving the other two around for some time so that users who don't want to move over or are missing features that they want in the React Native app have a place to like live as a home. But you don't want to maintain that forever, that status quo. If you end up having to maintain all three forever, at some point, like, users never like change, right? That's why whenever I see someone come across and like, hey, I want this new UI. It's really fancy. It looks really different. I'm like, I don't know if that's a good idea. Like, maybe we should make little gradual changes if we want to do that rather than like rug pulling, pull the lever. Like, that's not necessarily the best idea.
It's become extremely obvious you have never worked for Atlassian because they are our UI rugful extraordinaires over yonder.
I know. I don't know why Jira changes the way it looks. I swear every other week and sometimes more than others.
And it continues to bury the really useful stuff deeper and deeper into the settings.
Yeah. Yeah.
Apparently, this is just the podcast where we beat up on JavaScript and we beat up on Atlassian and Jira. It's been
It feels like a theme. It really does.
Yeah, you're in between a rock and a hard place because Jira is definitely the one you probably want to use out of all the options, but you just got to leave it alone, man.
Just for a minute.
We were so friendly when we started this whole thing out, and now it's like it's been enough time. Like the gloves are coming off, and we're just being angry at the service providers we rely on.
Who's the whipping boy today? I don't know. It's the punching bag.
No, Jira is hands down the worst workflow management tool, except for every other one that I've used.
There you go.
So anyway, sorry, just wanted to venture into a little smack at Jira for doing the UI rug pull. What you were saying that was really interesting. I had never considered this in a mobile context. So like a lot of times for web apps, if we're replacing a legacy system that has users and is going to stay online, we'll stand up a second website or a second web application. And then over time, we'll just gradually start turning on the new version of it and turning off the old version of it and then keeping them linked up. But the cool thing about that is in the web world, we control everything. So we could just do whatever we want. In the app world, you would have to actually have a user install 2 different apps, both the legacy one and the new one. And then it seems like linking between those could be dubious as well. Have you even seen that before, Kevin? That seems really strange to me.
So I haven't seen that, but now that I think about it, there probably is a way to do this kind of probably not super well. You'd probably still want a separate app rolled out. But at least within Google Play, you can choose to do gradual rollouts of a new version of an app. So it could theoretically be done where you have the new version, you upload that as your new bundle, and you set it to 5% user rollout, and 6, 7, 8, and slowly roll through like that. So that's one option. But yeah, I don't know. I hadn't really thought about that. That could work.
I mean, fundamentally it would require a user to install both the new and old version of the app, and then routing between the two could be hard, but I hadn't even thought about doing that kind of piecewise approach where we're just kind of segmenting one chunk at a time over to the new app and then shutting it down on the old one in a mobile context.
Yeah, it's hard to say.
It would be challenging to manage, I would think, too, though. You'd definitely have to keep track of what the interconnected bits are, what you've extracted already, and we get to be a little bit of a project management nightmare.
So this is now us noodling on a problem that we don't have, but I think it's interesting. So what if you had your old native mobile app and then you had a React Native, you published to a website, to an S3 bucket or something, your React Native for web, and then you replaced that view in the old app with a web view. So you released a new version of the old app, but that old app would be a web view of the new React Native for web S3 hosted React Native app. And then once you replace enough of that with the React Native for web view, your existing legacy app would basically become a series of web views to their new React Native for web thing. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So that's what I was getting at before. I don't know if I've ever tried this. I definitely haven't actually, now that I think about it. But I think theoretically, as long as you have the app signing keys and you own those and you have the app ID and everything, you could just build the new React Native app with the same signing keys, with the same identifier, and then push that up as your update to the app on Google Play. And then from there, you could do a similar thing where you have your new update there and you slowly roll the number of users that have it. So you don't actually change your app. No one has to reinstall anything. And slowly the old one just disappears.
That makes sense too for a cutover of one entire old app for one entire new one. I was trying to think of a way to remove one feature at a time from the old app.
Yeah, I don't know.
I would have to do some research before I pitched it to a client, but it might actually work. I'd be curious to have that problem show up so I could try to solve it.
That's kind of you got to wonder if the juice is worth the squeeze there too, though.
Yeah, it would have to be an enterprise level something. They're utilizing it for a lot of different departments or areas or utility that you could somewhat segregate pretty easily, I would think.
So we did a very similar thing with a HIPAA compliant app for healthcare data. And it was one of those things where the security can never go down. And this can't ever be compromised. So we actually stood up a transition API. We basically did one of these gradual step-by-step replacements on that app, but we actually put that customer in React Native from the get-go. But if they had an existing legacy app, we probably would have had to do something different. But anyway, I digress because it's technically challenging and probably not that relevant.
But fun. Good to go down the rabbit hole every once in a while.
Yeah. So we talked about the case for native apps and when that probably makes sense. It sounded like that's probably at this point in time kind of the exception rather than the rule, depending what your app is. But unless you have one of a few very specific reasons to go into a native app, you should probably default to a cross-compiling thing. And React Native is the most widely supported one right now. I know NativeScript is around and I think people are using this. As my personal taste, I prefer Angular over React a lot. So I'd love to have the Angular version of cross-compiling become more popular.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what else there is. I know we have one project that's using Next.js, and then I know Flutter exists. I've never used it personally, but it's there.
Yeah, I keep almost getting us a Flutter project because I really want to learn it. .NET kids have theirs, which is Xamarin, which we did one project in a long time ago. So there are a couple different options out there, but kind of without weighing the difference of frameworks to use, like what are the benefits? Because it sounds like primarily we want to end up probably in a cross-compiling app. So like, why is that? What's the good in sending us that direction?
Yeah, the one thing that immediately jumps out at me is you really don't have to deal with having two full separate apps. And at least from what I've seen, especially with having two apps, is a lot of times they don't get equally maintained. So if you have a client and that client uses an iPhone and everyone around them uses an iPhone and they want an app on Android and iOS, well, when they're thinking about updates, they're thinking very iOS centric. They're thinking, hey, we need this. So as they want the updates done, Android kind of lives off in like this lives off on their own little island, right? And iOS kind of marches forward and Android goes, hey, what's going on? I'm still over here. Like I'm doing the API target updates, but not much else. So once you have a cross-compiled app, that problem kind of goes by the wayside. You don't have to worry about it as much, which is a big plus. One of the other big pluses there that kind of ties into that is you're going to have one common UI. There's an argument with native that you get a UI that looks a lot more like the platform, but I don't really necessarily think that's entirely always true because you kind of end up in the same situation where the client uses one device, so they want the app to look like it would on their device. So you end up with an app on Android that looks like an iOS app. And at least with React Native, you're going to have one rather than two instances of trying to do this. And it might be easier to say, hey, let's try making something that looks more common rather than trying to say, hey, this doesn't look Android. Hey, this doesn't look iOS. It might be easier to kind of move towards that goal. But yeah, I would say generally, unless you have a need to go with a native app, it probably makes more sense to go React Native or something that's cross-compiling. And the reasons for that, I don't think are usually super prevalent.
Yeah, it seems like it would give a lot more flexibility and ability to be creative for UI, UX, design team folks where you're not tied down necessarily to particular design components or elements or iconography or things like that for a particular thing. You can be a lot more creative, I would think, in those spaces and be more common.
The other thing that plays into that too is how the actual UI gets built on a native app versus on React. Like React Native, you have a very DOM-like structure. So someone who's used to doing, CSS or UI design, they're going to be much more capable of easily stepping in and making UI tweaks there than, say, Android with Views or Jetpack Compose. And if you're working with an older Android app, it's probably going to be Vue. And it's not the easiest thing to make Vue do what you want it, to put it lightly. It's not the worst thing to design with, but you can end up in really weird situations like word wrapping or how you want the different layouts to nest with each other. And it's probably going to be a lot harder to have your UI designer come into that and change that around a bit than it would be for them to look at something that has a DOM structure that better resembles what you'd see on a web app.
So yeah, with the separate code bases, I imagine also comes having separate team members who know different languages and have different skill sets. Is there much overlap between, Objective-C and Kotlin don't seem like they have a lot to do with one another as someone who hasn't really worked with either of them.
That's fair. To be honest, I haven't really done much iOS development at all. The most I've done is like installed Xcode on a MacBook to try and compile something to see like, hey, what does this look like? Or what is this doing? Or why does this work one way and mine doesn't work quite the same? Because yeah, it is a pretty different world or it really is. There's no real way to do like native iOS development easily if you don't have a Mac and you don't have an iPhone. So
yeah, it's the typical Apple vendor lock-in thing. For a while, we were using a service where we were literally paying. It's a service called Mac and Cloud. If you want to sponsor us, you're welcome to. We literally paid like an hourly fee to use somebody else's Mac that we could VPN into for things like, we've already done all the build, the entire thing exists, but we can't actually send the build to the App Store without owning a Mac computer. So we would rent a spot on theirs and we would send a zip file up and then run the program that had to be used to upload a zip file, essentially, because Apple makes strange architecture decisions. So yeah, that tracks. The bigger negative just being though, like if you actually are going to go native and you don't have one person who's an expert at both Android and iOS, which is probably somewhat of a rare person, then you're going to end up with two teams, or at least if you don't end up with two teams, you have two skill sets you have to hire for potentially if you have turnover or something. How about falling out of sync with things that can be done on the web? Does React Native solve that problem?
I don't necessarily think that there's going to be a big difference in that solution between using something that's native versus something that's React Native for an app. If you just mean like keeping things up to date with how the website works, I don't think there'd be a huge difference there other than, like you said, having more team members to handle how the updates are done. Because it's a lot easier for someone who does web dev to slip into developing on React Native than it is to go and start doing things in Android or iOS natively. There's a really big skill set difference, or like just knowledge difference really, between doing that native development versus doing React Native, which is a lot easier. Because if you're familiar with JavaScript, you're already somewhat familiar with how it would go on React Native. If you're familiar with DOM, you're going to be familiar with how that would work. There's differences in the libraries and things, right? Like you're looking at Axios for HTTP requests, but things like that are going to be easier to pick up than trying to pick up a whole new ecosystem.
Yeah, that's actually right where I wanted to go at some point too, is just talking about the team structure itself. I mean, it's obvious that you would need an Android person, an iOS person, a web person, whatever it is that you're trying to do. As a startup, that's an important question, because we've asked others at what point do we want to talk about hiring or having our own dev staff? And what does that look like? What does that team look like? It would seem like getting something that can stand up very quickly, that can be platform agnostic and has I'm going to say easier to hire for, or perhaps more versatile hiring base as something that's not native would seem to be the direction to go, especially for a startup. Does that jive with kind of what you've seen?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. As long as, like I said, you're not in a situation where you need something really specific to the platform, like you're really desperately in need of a high level of performance that you're not going to get otherwise. But yeah, I would agree. And one of the other risks you can run into, especially when you have two people doing app design and development on separate platforms, is you can end up with two entirely different structures to the same solution. And you can have one that works significantly better than the other, and you kind of get stuck. In one becomes a money hole, the other works fine, and you ask, well, what happened here? Did no one talk with each other as we were going through and designing these? And like as a startup, if you're a small company, having one half of the app become a money hole and the other work fine, maybe your balance sheet can do that, but you don't want anything to become that.
That's an excellent point, dude.
So we had one situation, didn't really end up working out. We didn't get to take the project all the way to the end, unfortunately, but we had a customer with a React app for web only, and they wanted to do a mobile app. What we did is we took them from a React app, which is very out of date, updated it completely, and then made a move from React over to React Native, which was not painless, but it was a relatively straightforward thing to do. Then what we did is we served out React Native for web in the same code base that always had for their front end. Then when it came time to make mobile apps out of it, like, yes, we had to do all the mobile app work to make things look correct. And it's not like you moved into React Native, you move a React web app into React Native, and suddenly you have a mobile app. It doesn't work that way. But what it did mean is that our web UI for users, our Android UI and our iOS UI all use the exact same code base. And so you basically paid one series of web developers who could figure out how to do React Native and do submissions and these kinds of things. And you had one monolithic code base. So you didn't have issues where like iOS users are able to do this, but Android users are not, but you can't do that on the web. So I've very strangely really only seen that once. And I think a much more common model for us is that we have a Ruby on Rails API with an admin interface that's written just in plain old Rails. And then we have a mobile app for users, which we use React Native to compile between Android and iOS. But for this particular user who had a web app that was in React for users and then also wanted to move into the mobile space, I thought it was a really elegant solution. I wish we had the opportunity to get all the way to the finish line on it.
So, Kevin, I want to talk a minute about you specifically, but also in general, reskilling. You kind of came in, at least to our company, as I'm sure that others have in other organizations as well, as an Android developer, and made the move over to React Native. You still do some Android support, obviously, but I'm curious how that process worked for you, how that felt for you. Was it a big step? Would you say that, having Android in the bank made it easier to get to React Native? Were there comparatives, that sort of thing? What kind of advice might you give for someone who's moving in a similar direction, which it sounds like the industry as a whole is?
It's kind of a hard question to answer, honestly, just because there's so many different ways that people like to learn different skill sets. I think that moving to React Native from Android or iOS is probably more difficult than moving to it from a web dev side of things. And the course I took was like, before I worked Android, I did C++, assembly, embedded development, and then I did Android, and then I did a bit of Ruby on Rails there, and then it became the Ruby on Rails with the React. So I kind of had like that intermediary step of, wetting my toes into working with a web development system. I started to learn JavaScript, things like that are really important for learning React Native. And I think that kind of helped me out personally. But if you're trying to learn it from the get-go. I think it can be really helpful if you have a team available to you. That's really helpful. Here at Delta, like everyone is super good at helping each other out. And that really benefited me a lot going into React Native and Ruby on Rails for that matter. Because going into Android or learning that, it was me by myself figuring things out. So if you have people you can lean on at all, like don't hesitate to do that. Sometimes you can feel really silly asking a question, but more times than not, it's better to simply just ask away, I think. As long as you've done like the modicum of research where you can ask an intelligent question that doesn't end you up with an XY problem or something strange like that. But I would definitely say if you have a community you can lean on to ask questions and learn more quickly and effectively like that, it's going to be a million times over useful.
So with like regard to developing your overall like developer skill set, I have kind of a bias, but like for me, working with someone who's done embedded systems or systems programming is like working with a classically trained musician. It's the patience and the fundamentals that kind of are inherent with doing that kind of work. It's just you have this very kind of deep understanding and background. And it to me is kind of like foundational and in my limited experience, but I see a lot of people who have those kinds of backgrounds be more successful in picking up new things and kind of reskilling. To me, that kind of comes down to like fundamentals and foundations. So I guess if you have any ability to comment on your own experience, do you think having those kinds of like embedded in systems experiences in the background set you up for this? Or is this just a snowball of skills you just keep rolling and it gets easier to aggregate as the diameter gets bigger?
I think it can help, especially for like getting a baseline understanding of like how you want to develop things. Because when you have fewer tools available to you, like when you're working with C or C++, like sure, C++, you can pull in libraries, but is that always the right solution? It's not necessarily a good idea even. So there's a lot that you're kind of building in a bespoke manner. So you have to gain some level of understanding of a lot of different concepts. And as you move forward, I think that can really help you design things that are simpler or design things that are less reliant on the ecosystem as a whole. That said, there is the other half of that. Switching to Ruby on Rails was very difficult because looking at that, there's so much that just the Ruby on Rails magic that happens under the hood. And I would go, what do you mean? It just does this and that. Like, where are the intermediary steps? Like, I'm trying to figure out why this isn't working. And I'm going from A to C. Where is step B? And all the little things that go along with that. And I think getting over that or getting used to that being a reality with like the higher level frameworks can be a real struggle sometimes, especially like having done some things in the past, like where you have like million line code bases and there's something going wrong in an intermediary layer in like just the weirdest way. And you're looking at this huge state machine that was auto-generated and nobody has the code that generated it. So all the function names are like X_18936. And you look at it and you go, oh God. So you have to like get out your pad of paper and like step through it. So once you're like dealt with problems like that a lot, it can be really uncomfortable to go into a place where there's a lot of magic in the middle and you don't necessarily trust the magic anymore. So I think that's probably true of really any platform you go to, whether it's React Native, Android, or Ruby on Rails. There's just a little bit of discomfort there initially, getting over that hump.
We hear from the PHP team too on the Laravel stuff. Anytime that you're stepping up to those supporting frameworks where there is some degree of black box, stuff goes in and poof, awesome things come out. Or junk in, junk out. That's always fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, those abstractions are incredibly powerful and they make our lives great. But when something goes wrong in one of those layers of abstraction, it takes a lot of talent and a lot of patience to get to the bottom of that and to resolve it. I think in Rails, we see this most frequently with devise, because devise is a very commonly used thing, and we always seem to need to customize or change or tweak something about how it works. And I'm not quite at the level of saying devise is its own skill set, but the configuring and debugging and working with devise flows and stuff is a little arcane, and it definitely takes some talent to pick up. So that's actually great intuition I hadn't considered before. Is like, yeah, systems background, you're doing everything by hand. You know exactly how control flow is passing for every single line of code. And there's a lot of other people who've done work that help us in some of these higher level languages and large web frameworks.
This also makes me think of too, Kevin, I know that recently we've been working on a project that was a native application. It's Android and iOS, but there was a reliance on a particular third-party library that no longer got updated or is no longer, available to the community. It occurs to me that in the past, I have also seen that on other platforms too. I mean, things that are very plugin based, even like WordPress, somebody no longer is supporting the plugin that runs 80% of your site. I'm curious to get your take on how much easier it is to combat that sort of a situation when you're dealing with the native application versus dealing with a somewhat similar situation. Perhaps it's another library, we'll call them plugin, for the web-based or browser-based.
In a native application context or like just in the browser or?
Yeah, well, I mean, is something like that easier to deal with ordinarily when you're Android iOS? Or is it easier to deal with when you're React Native or some other front end?
Gotcha. I think things like that can potentially be easier to deal with in native. So because you're closer to the actual hardware or the actual operating system and all the things that are packaged with it, if you lose a package that lets you interface with that, or you lose a plugin that lets you interface with that, you can be stranded otherwise if there's nothing like equivalent available. Given you still have to write out a lot of custom code, something bespoke to do the job, but it may be easier to get the job done. Say you need a video encoding library that may or may not have stopped existing.
For example,
As a hypothetical.
A hypothetical library that stopped existing. If you were on React Native and that video encoding library went away, you may be in pretty hot water for how you want to deal with that situation. You might end up having to look at building out a native module to go and do that work. Versus Android or iOS, where you have a number of different options where you can sidestep into. It may be more annoying, it may be more work to get done, but it could be potentially easier to go ahead and do that work.
Well, it sounds like we're removing one layer of abstraction. So instead of relying on a React Native thing, which relies on an Android thing, which now no longer exists, you don't have to find the new Android thing and the new React Native thing. You can just solve the problem in Android.
Exactly.
Interesting. Yeah, we run into that sometimes on just the base web stuff too, depending on what your framework happens to be. We have had in the past where a plugin has just dried up or no longer gotten support, and you have to literally write the custom code for it to mimic at least the most important bits of functionality while you're either shopping for something different or considering a rewrite at that point, depending on how heavy of a lift the thing is supposed to do.
Yeah, then you end up in the situation of like, do we just want to fork it and try and maintain it ourselves?
Right. Yep.
Having done some stuff in the open source ecosystem before, that kind of goes both ways. Because once you start doing that, you become the support team.
Yep.
And being that support team is not very fun, to say the least.
Yeah.
Yeah, the amount of aggression and entitlement people have brought to me over using something that I maintain for free and publish as an ICD is always surprising. It's like, also, you're welcome, I guess. I'm sorry there's a bug in the free thing that I gave you.
Yeah, there's nothing that sucks the motivation dry faster than that.
Yeah.
Just see a GitHub issue. This thing is useless. It's trash. Why did you even bother? And it's like, yeah, well, hey, I'm really sorry.
Out of the kindness of my heart.
Yeah,
I didn't realize the internet was running low on space for me to publish things. I do apologize for the room that I'm taking up here on the web. Yeah.
Let me point you at some similar things that are slightly different that maybe you'll like better.
So, Kev, one thing we haven't really touched on, and I'm kind of interested in too, because this is fun work for me because I love to break stuff. I'm really good at breaking things. But how do these two worlds look in terms of like the testing and debugging processes? Do you have a personal preference? And if not, what do the approaches look like there?
If I want to be fully honest, I don't think I have ever inherited or worked on an Android native project where there has been a test suite set up.
Wait a second, let me find my shock face.
Yeah, it just has not existed. Debugging, I think, can look pretty similar. There are some decent debug tools available on the Android platform, but at the end of the day, you've always got the old handy print to console as a backup option. Tried and true, really. It works in every ecosystem.
Yep. I'm a puts debugger myself, and I work with these school programmers, and they're like, what are you doing, Grandpa? And I'm like, well, solving the problem that you asked for help with. So we're gonna lean on my wisdom and how I know how to work. So
it's really funny, too, because you go far enough back, and you're like hooking up the physical debugger to the hardware to debug it. You're looking at the registers, and you're like, oh, this isn't working, right? And then you move a little bit more forward, and it's like, oh, well, now we're just putting to console. And then you forward again, and you're wanting to use a debugger again. It's like, oh, hey, look at this. We've come all the way around.
Yeah, the next phase of that is my LLM didn't solve the problem without me understanding what it was. So,
oh my goodness.
I can't vibe code my way to victory. Oh no.
Clients are already sending in the AI generated stuff. It's like, here, I wrote this function for you. It's like, well, you didn't, but thanks, that's adorable.
I'll go ahead and just blend that snippet in with the 15 years that I've been doing this professionally and see if I can get to a solution.
Yeah, I can't wait until like you get given a huge 100,000 line project and you look at it and you go, what is this? How did this get made? What is this software? Why is this here? And then you ask and they're like, oh yeah, I asked ChatGPT to output it. And you're like, oh no.
I'm here to tell you, Kevin, I've seen more than one project in my career that was not written by AI where that was exactly what I did and what I said. And I was like, we can't actually use this. We had a project, I'll not say the name of it, but there was an acronym for the project that ended with A. And we ended up creating the same version. And then the acronym ended with B. but the B didn't actually go with the acronym of what the tool was actually called. It was just funny to us that we took, like, say the last word was like, we'll call it the Big Fancy Assessment, the BFA. We wrote the BFB, and they're like, what does the B stand for? We're like, well, it's the letter after A. So it's the Big Fancy Assessment B. Anyway. So probably coming into the end of our time here, I want to put a little bit of a bow on native versus React Native and when we choose to use native, which seems rarely, and then the benefits of React Native. So it sounds like native, if you have to get really close to the machine, if you are needing to integrate with some hardware, performance is a huge thing for your app. If you have a strong preference for the user interface or the kind of user experience of the app ecosystem. Anything else on that list of strong reasons to look into native?
I think one other compelling reason is, we touched on it earlier, what your staffing situation looks like. If you have a really strong Android developer and a really strong iOS developer, you might just be better off having two separate native apps still in terms of cost, time, and effort than trying to get them to play nicely with React Native and work on something like that together. There's probably a pretty strong, compelling argument there.
It makes sense.
It does make sense. An emerging theme on this show is that the tech doesn't really matter all that much if you have a great team and a consultant you love, or someone who's really competent, really good. You can still write great software that does everything it needs to in COBOL if you have to. So I don't think you should necessarily optimize for that. But so on the React Native side, then for benefits, one code base is huge. You can line up your experiences so you don't have feature drift between the two. You're kind of getting out of the way for API changes. You got a team of people maintaining open source libraries who make sure that you're kind of up to date with all the compliance, API, Apple, Google stuff. Potentially, you don't have to hire for more skill sets, and the skill sets are likely to cross-talk with your web team if you already have one. What else?
UI UX design freedom is probably a plus for the React Native side.
And alignment between platforms as well.
Yeah, or at least an easier time having more people step in to look at and poke at the UI. Because, Android side, there's newer ways of building the UI than views. You can use Jetpack Compose now, but a lot of old projects are still just going to be views, and nobody is really going to step in and try and poke at that because it's just terrible to do. Yeah, I would say even with some of those performance and how close you need to be to the metal questions, if you're looking at writing a native module or something like that, you can probably get around a lot of that just like that. So I would say really, unless you have a really strong performance reason or you have a team that wants a native app, I would say probably it makes more sense to go with something that will cross-compile to either.
All right, beautiful. Anything else you want to add in summary, Aaron?
Nope. I think we wrapped it up nicely. I would say that there's obvious answer, but the nice thing is it's always a conversation, right? We are consultants first and foremost, and the idea here is to help get the client to the solution that they need, not the other way around.
It depends is always the right answer. And
Yep.
I'll give you the 80% probably right for you answer, but there's always that 20% of it depends. So, all right, beautiful. Well, if you are interested in working with Kevin, working with me, working with Aaron, you can find us all at deltasystems.com. That'll do it for this week. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for checking into SaaS That App. Aaron, Kevin, it's been a slice, gentlemen.
Thanks as always. Have a good one, guys. Thanks for cruising along with us on SaaS That App. We hope you grabbed some insights that were inspiring, actionable, or at least entertaining.
If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review.
Until next time, keep building, keep growing, and keep those apps sassy.